It's hard to ignore some of the pretty stark warnings we're hearing these days. Colonel Douglas McGregor, in a recent interview, he really didn't hold back.
Yeah.
Said we might be heading towards Armageddon now.
Yeah, that definitely gets your attention.
It does, right.
And it's why we thought, okay, we need to take a closer look at this interview. Our job here really is to unpack these, strong statements for you.
Sort of cut through the noise.
Exactly. Understand the reasoning behind them, distill what the core concerns are. We're trying to guide you through what can feel like pretty complex and maybe unsettling territory.
And McGregor's got that long experience, hasn't
Yeah.
he? So his perspective carries weight.
Definitely. He's looking at things through a very critical lens.
Okay, so we've got his analysis. Let's dig in.
Oh, yeah?
He starts with this global trade situation. Says it's gone beyond just targeted tariffs.
Yeah, he sees it escalating into more like a blanket global war on trade, as he put it. He seems quite concerned, maybe even disappointed about that shift.
And the impact.
Yeah.
He mentioned the bond market.
Right. And this is interesting. He highlights this immediate negative reaction in the bond market. Apparently, some people expected these policies to actually draw foreign money into U.S. bonds.
But that's not what happened.
No, the opposite. It seems global finance kind of views these broad tariffs as destabilizing, increases risk,
Well-
So it undermined the very market they maybe hoped to boost.
So it hits an economy he already sees as fragile, adding fuel to the fire, maybe?
That's precisely his point, adding instability onto an already, let's say, delicate situation.
And how are other countries taking it? He mentioned Japan.
Yeah, he brought up some pretty direct feedback. Japan apparently saying something like, look, this isn't logical, you're not listening. Even referencing mathematical critiques, possibly echoing someone like Elon Musk's comments on Navarro.
Wow, that's blunt. From a key ally, too.
It is. It shows the level of disagreement out there.
He also used that hypothetical, didn't he? The 100% tariff on foreign movies.
Right. Maybe a bit of an extreme example, but it makes the point, doesn't it? About potential unintended consequences if policies aren't really thought through.
Makes you wonder, does the U.S. really grasp its leverage anymore?
That's a huge question he raises. He points to Ukraine as a place where, our assumed leverage hasn't exactly produced the outcomes we might have wanted.
Despite all the sanctions and everything.
Exactly. It raises that broader question. Is our understanding of our own global influence maybe a bit out of date?
Which kind of links to those earlier warnings he mentioned from Gunlock and DiMartino Booth.
Yes, exactly. They apparently flagged the potential negative impacts of tariffs quite early on.
So these worries aren't entirely new.
Not according to him, which makes the current situation, maybe even more concerning if the warnings were there.
Okay, so this leads him to de-dollarization. That seems like a big deal.
It is. This idea that countries are increasingly moving away from using the U.S. dollar for trade.
Which weakens the dollar's global standing.
Potentially, yes. He specifically mentions China and Japan trading more in their own currencies. And that feeds into this fascinating speculation.
Is this all part of some grand plan? Like a controlled demolition?
Right, to bring in something new, a new Bretton Woods, maybe tied to gold, or even Bitcoin, as some people theorize.
That sounds pretty conspiratorial, though. Does McGregor buy that?
He seems skeptical. He leans more towards attributing current policies to maybe emotion and impulse rather than some hidden master plan, coupled with a misreading of the global situation.
And he points to the practical constraints, like the national debt interest.
Yeah, soaring interest payments. He says it's over $1 trillion now. That really ties your hands, economically speaking.
$1 trillion just on interest. Wow.
It severely limits maneuverability. And as for returning to something like Bretton Woods or fixing the existing system, is not optimistic. Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
He seems to think that system might just be fundamentally over. He even threw in that historical analogy about gold demand in London before World War I.
What was that about?
Kind of hinting that when global instability rises, capital might flee established financial centers for, tangible assets, a historical echo, maybe.
Interesting. He also mentioned debt jubilees from history, like wiping the slate clean.
Yeah, Holy Roman Empire, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, places where rulers basically reset the debts.
Could that happen now?
Well, he points out the power dynamic is different. Bankers hold a lot more sway today. His take seems to be that there was this expectation that other countries would just fold.
Just line up and do what we say.
Yeah, which he attributes to, in his words, hubris, arrogance, and ignorance of reality. He keeps stressing the world isn't 1991 anymore.
Which connects to his idea about civilizational states rising.
Exactly. This shift away from that unipolar moment, he sees the reemergence of these big historical cultural blocs: Russia, China, Japan, Iran, Persia, Turkey, each with its own agenda.
And Washington is struggling to adapt to that.
That's his argument. A failure to really grasp that the world has changed and that these other powers have their own interests and motivations.
Like his take on Russia in Ukraine, that it's defensive.
Right. He frames it as Russia seeing NATO expansion as a threat on its border, not as some plan to conquer Europe. He uses that analogy. How would the U.S. feel if Mexico or Canada joined a hostile military alliance?
Try to get you to see it from their perspective.
Precisely. And he argues that failing to understand these perspectives leads to, well, bad conclusions, like misunderstanding why the bond markets are reacting negatively. It's a chain reaction.
Okay, let's shift to the financial instability side. That phrase, Armageddon now, that's heavy.
It is. It signals his belief in the potential for really significant economic disruption. And he stresses we need to own up to, past mismanagement.
A big part of that for him is military spending.
Right. Huge part. He questions $1 trillion defense budget, asks if we really need all these overseas commitments. He even brings up Paul Kennedy's work.
The rise and fall of the great powers?
Yeah, the idea that empires decline when they overextend themselves militarily and economically. He sees parallels.
Is he saying we're creating phantom threats?
He suggests we might be exaggerating dangers, creating tensions unnecessarily. And he points to the talk around Iran as a major concern.
The potential for another Middle East war, despite promises otherwise.
Right. He questions how immediate the threat from Iran's nuclear program actually is to the U.S. homeland, and he worries about the lack of real debate on whether military action is wise. He mentions Senator Fetterman's very strong stance as an example of the heated rhetoric.
And the ripple effects of a conflict like that. Energy supplies.
Big time. Disrupting oil and gas that our allies like Japan and China heavily rely on. He also touches on who might benefit Israel, perhaps, but also notes Turkey's rising influence in the region.
And Russia and China have interests there too, don't they, with the Belt and Road Initiative?
Absolutely. Regional stability matters to them. It just highlights how interconnected everything is, something he feels Washington sometimes underestimates.
Then he flips the script on who's indispensable. Says it's China now, not the U.S.
Yeah, that's a direct challenge to the idea of American exceptionalism in the global market. It forces that uncomfortable question. What are we actually producing that the world desperately needs?
His answer is pretty blunt. The 3 Bs.
Bushels, bonds, and bombs. It's a stark assessment, highlighting the decline in things like microchip manufacturing, the outsourcing of industry. And he's critical not just of China, but of those who, allowed that manufacturing base to be hollowed out here.
And the impact on the American worker.
He feels they're often left behind, feeling unheard, negatively impacted by policies, despite all the talk about focusing on Main Street. There's a lot of anxiety about a potential recession or crash.
So his message is kind of, you've been sold a bill of goods. These policies aren't helping ordinary people.
That seems to be the underlying message, yes. Even the idea of being an energy superpower doesn't mean much if you can't effectively get that energy to market where it's needed.
And he hits on broken promises too, like ending wars. Ukraine specifically.
Yeah, the failure to wind down conflicts, the continued aid to Ukraine, his critique of how Zelensky is portrayed. It all feeds into a sense of eroding trust and maybe ineffective policy.
He thinks we lack real leverage in Ukraine, that stopping support is the way out.
He argues that's the most direct way to push for an end to the fighting, questioning how much leverage we actually have otherwise. He sees it as a missed opportunity for a broader strategic stability deal with Russia and China.
Which brings us to policy errors more broadly. He's concerned about too much power in the White House.
Yes, what he calls presidential government, where the executive branch makes huge decisions and Congress kind of abdicates responsibility. He mentioned an anecdote about Charlie Rangel and the Libya intervention as an example.
What about potential fixes? Revaluing gold comes up sometimes.
He mentions people like Luke Groman suggesting it, but notes it could look like a default. McGregor himself seems to lean more towards the hard medicine, living within our means.
Which means budget cuts. Big ones.
Potentially massive cuts, he suggests, maybe trillions, including defense. And that forces those really tough conversations about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. He notes the history there, how Social Security started temporary but became permanent.
And the waste and fraud issue that Elon Musk flagged.
Yeah, that highlights how hard cuts are when so many people depend on these programs, even with inefficiencies. He senses a lack of societal appetite for, sacrifice or self-denial, that microwave mentality wanting quick fixes.
Reshoring manufacturing sounds good, but he sees challenges there too.
Big challenges. It takes huge long-term investment. And how do you make those bets when trade policy feels uncertain, shifting? He contrasts it with Henry Ford taking like 30 years to build his company. These things don't happen overnight.
So is the danger just ignoring reality,
Mm.
especially with something like Iran?
He warns against that. Ignoring the difficult messages, assuming we can act with impunity, he thinks that increases the risk of a much harder crash down the line. Maybe a kind of national narcissism, he suggests, is preventing a needed shift to focus inward, away from an outdated WWII global model.
And the defense industry pushes back against cuts.
Yeah, that's a major obstacle, he implies. Reorienting strategy, reducing spending, it runs counter to powerful interests. He holds up Eisenhower as someone who tried to balance security and prosperity with more controlled defense spending.
He also flags wealth concentration as a huge problem.
Yeah, says it's worse than ever, maybe more extreme than even the early 20th century. He uses that Dodge v. Ford court case as a turning point where shareholder value started to trump, say, worker benefit as the main corporate priority.
But just taking wealth from some and giving it to others isn't the answer.
No, he argues that kind of redistribution doesn't fundamentally work. He also brings up immigration, arguing that illegal immigration isn't a net benefit and affects jobs and wages for some, adds another layer of economic pressure.
And our political divisions don't help. The tribalism.
Makes it hard to have honest assessments, doesn't it, if you just defend your team? He quotes Peter Drucker, "You can't just take away the old, you have to offer something new, something compelling for people to move towards."
He talks about the financialization of the economy, too.
Right. This focus on, transaction fees and financial maneuvering over actually making things. He senses real anger from people involved in productive industries and perverse incentives where short-term stock buybacks are maybe rewarded more than long-term investment in the business or its people.
And that historical warning. Louis VI and the price of bread?
Yeah, a stark reminder. When basic needs aren't met, when costs spiral, history shows that can lead to significant upheaval. It's a warning about letting these economic and financial pressures build without addressing them.
Okay, so amidst all these challenges, he does bring up Bitcoin as an alternative.
He does. He frames it as, a non-fiat option, something outside government control, globally accessible, not tied to one nation's specific risks.
How does he see it playing out? Will people just jump in?
He expects it to be gradual, thinks Bitcoin might track the wider market for a while, maybe initially go down in a crash, before people start seeing it as a potential safe haven, a different kind of asset.
Why not just gold?
He mentions the practicalities. Hoarding large amounts of physical gold is difficult. Transacting with it isn't easy. And relying on other countries' currencies just shifts the risk, right? You're dependent on their stability.
People always worry about Bitcoin's value, though. It's volatile.
He acknowledges that uncertainty, the what's it really worth question, but he seems to believe in its potential long-term, maybe even eventually replacing fiat currency.
How does that compare to what the BRICS countries are doing with gold?
He contrasts it, sees the BRICS approach as hoarding gold centrally for transactions, whereas Bitcoin is decentralized by its nature. He points to flaws, maybe even corruption, he sees in the traditional system from the Fed to international settlement banks as reasons why people might look for alternatives.
So eventually people might feel there's nowhere else to go.
That seems to be his ultimate thesis on Bitcoin, that the limitations and potential instability of the current system will eventually drive people towards it, as they realize its unique properties.
So despite this pretty grim picture, Armageddon now, does he offer any hope?
He does, actually. He expresses a belief that the U.S. will get through these challenges, but it'll emerge changed, fundamentally different.
But he expects some rough times first. Civil unrest.
Yeah, he anticipates potential unrest, maybe starting this summer, could have racial dimensions, economic dimensions. He stresses the need to finally address these deep, underlying societal problems that we haven't solved.
What's the path forward then?
His hope lies in Americans eventually pulling together, a kind of national unity to restore the country, restore the rule of law. But he acknowledges it will take time, strength, effort. He mentions that Our Country, Our Choice initiative as a bipartisan effort trying to foster that.
But just praying isn't enough, he implies.
Right. He cautions against thinking simple or traditional responses will fix such deep issues. He also voices concerns about the military itself declining discipline, leadership challenges.
So back to that Eisenhower model, restraint.
Yeah, balancing security and prosperity, maybe reducing defense spending, reorienting strategy. He also emphasizes education, empowering people to understand the systems, like the banking system. He uses that Henry Ford quote.
About how if people understood banking, there'd be a revolution.
That's the one. The idea is understanding is the first step to demanding change. Ultimately, he says we need something new to do, a new approach, because the old ways in government and business might be obsolete, especially in this financialized world.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've gone through Colonel McGregor's pretty sobering analysis: trade wars, financial fragility, rising global powers, potential conflict, Bitcoin as an out. Quite a landscape.
Yeah, a lot of interconnected challenges. The core seems to be a concern about unsustainable policies, a failure to adapt to a changing world, and the potential consequences of that.
For me, the real takeaways were just how fragile he thinks the financial system is, the implications of this shift to civilizational states that really reframes things, and just the sheer scale of the fiscal challenges, like that $1 trillion interest payment. And yeah, the Bitcoin angle is fascinating food for thought.
And hopefully for you listening, this deep dive has given you a clearer handle on these complex arguments and the potential futures McGregor is outlining, a shortcut through some dense material.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, building on this. If the old ways, the traditional levers of power, are maybe losing their effectiveness, as McGregor suggests, where do the real solutions come from? Where should we be looking for genuine innovation and resilience?
Definitely something to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. If you want to hear the full original interview, you can find it with Colonel Douglas McGregor on the Natalie Brunell YouTube channel. And he also has a new series called McGregor. You can find that by searching Our Country, Our Choice.
Keep thinking critically, keep asking questions. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.